The moment my mother heard a complete stranger praise me in front of hundreds of wedding guests, her smile froze so fast that I almost did not recognize her. For 27 years, I had been invisible in my own family. Then, in less than 5 minutes, everything changed. The shocking part was not that people finally noticed me. The shocking part was realizing I no longer needed my family too. My name is Emily Carter, and for most of my life, I felt like a background character in my own story. Every family has a favorite child, even if people do not like admitting it. In my family, that child was my younger brother, Ryan. He was smart, athletic, charming, and naturally confident. Wherever he went, attention seemed to follow him. Teachers loved him, neighbors admired him, friends wanted to be around him. Most importantly, my parents treated him like he could do no wrong. I learned my place in the family at a very young age. When I was 7 years old, I remember standing quietly in a dark hallway outside our living room while my mother talked to my grandmother. Ryan had recently won another youth baseball tournament, and my mother could barely contain her excitement. She described him as if he were destined to become a professional athlete or some famous public figure. Every sentence was filled with pride and admiration. Then she noticed me standing there. For a moment, I thought she might invite me into the conversation or say something encouraging about me too. Instead, she smiled politely and continued talking about Ryan as if I had never appeared. It was a small moment, but it taught me a lesson I would carry for decades. As the years passed, that pattern never changed. Ryan collected trophies, certificates, awards, and recognition. The shelves in our house slowly transformed into a museum dedicated to his achievements. Whenever guests visited, my parents proudly walked them around the living room and pointed at everything he had accomplished. I often stood nearby smiling while feeling completely forgotten. It was not that I performed poorly. I earned excellent grades. I volunteered in community programs. I worked hard in school. But compared to Ryan, my accomplishments always seemed invisible. By high school, I had stopped competing for attention. There is only so much rejection a person can tolerate before they begin protecting themselves. I convinced myself that my parents' approval did not matter. I told myself I was independent and strong. Deep down, however, every ignored achievement still hurt. Every forgotten birthday conversation, every missed opportunity to ask about my life, every comparison to Ryan left another small scar. The strange thing was that I never blamed my brother. Ryan did not create the situation. He simply grew up inside it. He enjoyed the praise because that was all he had ever known. While our parents constantly elevated him, he never fully understood what it felt like to stand in my position. We were never enemies. In fact, I loved him. But there was always an invisible wall between us built from years of imbalance neither of us knew how to fix. After college, our lives moved in very different directions. Ryan attended law school and eventually became a successful corporate attorney. He was exactly the kind of professional my parents loved bragging about. Every holiday gathering included stories about his promotions, clients, and accomplishments. Meanwhile, I pursued a career as a guidance counselor at a public middle school. My work was not glamorous. It did not come with impressive titles or large paychecks, but it mattered. Every day, I worked with teenagers facing challenges most adults would struggle to survive. Some students dealt with poverty, others faced neglect, abuse, depression, or anxiety. Many simply needed someone willing to listen. Over time, I realized there were serious gaps in the support available to these kids. That realization eventually inspired me to create a nonprofit organization called Path Forward. Our mission was simple. We wanted to help struggling teenagers access mentorship, educational resources, emotional support, and career guidance. Building the organization was one of the hardest things I had ever done. During the day, I worked full-time at the school. At night, I wrote grant applications, organized fundraising events, met with volunteers, and handled endless paperwork. Most weekends disappeared into meetings and planning sessions. There were moments when I questioned whether the effort was worth it. Funding was limited, resources were scarce, progress often felt painfully slow. Yet every time a student succeeded because of our programs, I remembered exactly why I started. Unfortunately, my parents never seemed interested. Whenever I mentioned Path Forward, my mother referred to it as my little project. Sometimes she called it my little hobby. The words sounded harmless on the surface, but they carried years of dismissal behind them. She never asked how many students we helped. She never asked about our goals. She never asked how the organization was growing. In her mind, nothing I did could compete with Ryan's prestigious legal career. Then came the wedding. Ryan became engaged to a wonderful woman named Ava. Unlike many people in our family circle, Ava paid attention. She asked thoughtful questions. She listened carefully. Most importantly, she treated me like I mattered. Watching Ryan and Ava together genuinely made me happy because they clearly loved each other. The wedding took place at a stunning historic estate outside the city. The property looked like something from a movie. Massive stone buildings overlooked perfectly maintained gardens. Elegant lights decorated ancient trees. Luxury vehicles filled the parking area. More than 400 guests attended the event, and my mother proudly mentioned that fact to everyone she encountered. When I arrived, I quickly noticed where I fit into the picture. My parents sat proudly in the front row near the ceremony platform. My assigned seat was several rows behind them. Throughout the ceremony, I mostly stared at the back of my mother perfectly styled hair while Ryan and Ava exchanged heartfelt vows. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Ryan even became emotional during parts of it. Watching him cry unexpectedly brought tears to my own eyes. During cocktail hour, my mother approached me briefly. She complimented my dress, gave me a quick hug, and disappeared almost immediately after spotting someone more important across the room. The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Somehow, it perfectly summarized our relationship. The reception hall was breathtaking. Warm lighting reflected off polished floors while hundreds of guests laughed, danced, and celebrated. As I searched for my assigned seat, I felt a familiar disappointment settle into my chest. My table sat near the far corner of the room with a poor view of the dance floor and stage. Most of the guests at my table were strangers. An older couple politely introduced themselves and eventually asked how I knew the bride and groom. When I explained that I was the groom's sister, they looked genuinely surprised. Their reaction stung more than I wanted to admit. Apparently, I had been placed so far outside the spotlight that people could not even identify me as immediate family. As dinner progressed, the speeches began. My father stood confidently before the crowd and delivered a moving tribute to Ryan. He spoke about discipline, character, intelligence, and perseverance. The audience applauded repeatedly. Every word painted a picture of the son he had always admired. Near the end of the speech, my father proudly declared how grateful he was for his family. His eyes briefly scanned the room. For one hopeful second, I raised my glass. But his gaze passed over me without recognition. Something inside me cracked. I quietly excused myself and walked toward the restroom. Standing alone before the mirror, I stared at my reflection. I looked successful. I looked composed. I looked like someone who belonged in that room. Yet emotionally, I felt like an outsider attending a stranger's celebration. For the first time in my life, I seriously considered leaving. A quiet voice inside my head whispered that nobody would notice, nobody would care, nobody would come looking for me. I stood there for several minutes fighting tears and disappointment. Then I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and returned to the reception. I did not know it then, but that decision would change the entire night. About 10 minutes after returning to my table, a distinguished older man approached with a warm smile. He introduced himself as Dr. Benjamin Lawson. At first, the name sounded familiar without any clear reason. Then he mentioned his daughter, Chloe. Instantly, everything clicked. Several months earlier, Chloe had walked into my office carrying an overwhelming amount of emotional pain. She struggled with depression and isolation. During our sessions, she often spoke about feeling invisible and hopeless. I listened, I encouraged her, I reminded her that her life mattered. Week after week, she slowly began rebuilding her confidence. Now her father stood before me with gratitude written across his face. His voice softened as he explained that I had changed his daughter's life. He told me I was the first adult who truly made her feel seen. Hearing those words hit me harder than I expected. I spent years desperately wanting someone to see me, yet somehow, I had spent my life helping others feel valued despite never receiving that same validation myself. Then Dr. Lawson shared news that completely took my breath away. He congratulated me. Confused, I asked why. He smiled and explained that Path Forward had just been approved for a federal grant, worth nearly $2 million spread over 3 years. For several seconds, I could not speak. I genuinely thought I had misheard him. The application process had taken months. The competition was intense. Hundreds of organizations applied every year. I never expected our small nonprofit to be selected. Yet according to Dr. Lawson, the approval had already been finalized. The room seemed to blur around me. Every sleepless night, every rejection, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt. Suddenly, it all felt worth it. As we continued talking, Dr. Lawson demonstrated a deep understanding of our mission. He discussed expansion plans, community impact, and future opportunities. Unlike most people, he understood exactly why our work mattered. For the first time that evening, I felt completely confident and engaged. Then my mother appeared. She had clearly noticed an influential guest speaking with me and wanted to investigate. Using her polished social voice, she introduced herself and casually mentioned that she was my mother. Dr. Lawson immediately smiled. Then he began praising me, not politically, not casually, enthusiastically. He described the impact of Path Forward, He explained how many young lives had been changed. He discussed the federal grant and our future expansion plans. Finally, he looked directly at my mother and said she must be incredibly proud of her daughter. The silence that followed felt endless. My mother's smile froze. For perhaps the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing to say. A few moments later, my father joined us. Like many people at the reception, he recognized Dr. Lawson's importance immediately. As the conversation continued, I watched confusion spread across both my parents' faces. They were hearing strangers describe accomplishments they had never bothered learning about. They were discovering a version of me they had ignored for years. When Dr. Lawson eventually walked away, neither parent spoke right away. Instead, they simply stared at me, not with admiration, not even with pride, with realization, a realization that had arrived decades too late. Later that night, Ryan found me standing near the dance floor. His expression carried genuine regret. He admitted that Ava had been following path forward work for months and had repeatedly told him how impressive it was. Then he apologized, not because he was successful, not because her parents favored him, but because he had remained silent. He admitted that he should have acknowledged my accomplishments long ago. He should have spoken up when people overlooked me. He should have done more as my brother. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then I told him the truth. I loved him, I always would, but things needed to change. I explained that I was done chasing validation, done fighting for scraps of attention, done shrinking myself to fit inside other people's expectations. From that point forward, I would decide how much access people had to my life, including family. Ryan nodded slowly. Then he hugged me. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully accept it. When I finally left the reception later that night, I walked alone to my car just as I had arrived. The estate glowed behind me while music echoed into the darkness. Yet something felt completely different. For years, I believed happiness would come when my parents finally recognized my worth. I was wrong. True freedom arrived when I stopped needing them to. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I realized the world had already seen my value. The students I helped saw it. Their families saw it, my colleagues saw it. Complete strangers saw it. The only person who had not fully seen it was me. And that night, everything finally changed. Because after a lifetime of feeling invisible, I discovered something powerful. You do not need permission to matter. You do not need approval to have value. And sometimes the people who overlook you the longest are the ones who are shocked when the rest of the world finally notices your light.